Katherine Knight was a 40-year-old living in the small town of New South Wales, Australia. As a child, she had a tough upbringing, with alcoholic parents and abusive older siblings, but she never stopped wishing for a family of her own. Despite the many failed relationships, she held out hope and continued to look for Mr. Right. That's when she met John Price. John was also 40 years old, had a few children of his own, and seemed to be a much healthier fit than her previous partners. Katherine soon fell head over heels for John. Although the relationship started out great, it began to hit a rough patch when Katherine started inquiring about John's thoughts on getting married, of which he was not too keen on, seeing as he had just gotten out of an unsuccessful marriage. Over time, this would draw a wedge between the two lovers. John wasn't sure if he would ever want to get married again, and all Katherine wanted was a perfect family of her own. This rift became too much for Katherine to bear, and she would eventually move out. Over the next few weeks, she would second-guess her choice and would continuously try to mend their relationship and get back together, before ultimately separating again. This would continue until one fateful evening. In another attempt to repair the relationship, Katherine would go to John's house, pick up his children and bring them to a babysitter's. John would eventually come home and read the note she had left. Although reasonably upset, he sat in his apartment and waited for Katherine to return. Upon returning, John's attraction to Katherine would overpower his level of discontent and the two would begin making up once again. After a night of intimacy, Katherine would be laying in bed next to John, when all of a sudden, she would sit up and have an overwhelming feeling of disgust and hate towards the man she had just seduced into bed. Feeling as if she was being used and taken advantage of, she decided then and there he had to pay. You see, Katherine worked in a meat processing plant. More specifically in the kill room, which is where they would kill and slaughter cattle. While John was fast asleep, Katherine would go to her apartment and retrieve her butcher's knives, before quickly returning to John's home. She would then walk into his room, and being careful not to wake him, she would sit on his lap. And with two hands gripping the blade of her knife, she would plunge it directly into John's chest. He would wake up and try to run, but would ultimately fall at the front door. Police were informed about John not arriving at work, and upon searching his home would find a dinner table filled with an impressive spread, but no John in sight. Or so they thought. It appeared as if a Thanksgiving meal had been prepared, with place cards at all of the seats with John's children's names written on them. Nothing seemed amiss, but as they would walk into the living room, they would see the place was completely covered in blood. They would follow a blood trail to a closet, but when they opened it there was nothing but a curtain hanging inside. The officer would go to move the curtain to the side and realize that it was in fact not a curtain at all, it was all of John's skin, hanging in one whole piece like a wetsuit. Katherine would be found behind a couch barely clinging to life. She had apparently attempted to take her own life by taking an overdose of sleeping pills, but the paramedics would be able to save her. As they would discover, Katherine had skinned John entirely, cooked his flesh into a half-dozen delectable dishes, and placed his head in a pot of boiling water on the stove with some vegetables. She had planned to feed John to his own children, until she seemingly had a moment of clarity about the things she had done, and realizing that she didn't want to face the consequences, tried to take her own life. Upon her recovery, she was arrested, and in the subsequent trial was the first woman, in the history of Australia, to be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your dinner.